This game's awesome. James Rolfe's a talented amateur filmmaker with great potential for bigger and better things, but for his supposed review of Castlevania II Simon's Quest, the angry Nintendo nerd obviously wasn't thinking straight. In fact, I think before this he was snorting a few Rolling Rocks if you get my drift. Didn't I already use that intro already? Well, why not a second time? Castlevania II Simon's Quest was my first ever foray into the long-running Castlevania franchise, and it was perhaps one of the few games that I knew a few people who owned a copy back in the old days. Thus, it wouldn't be uncommon for the group of us to exchange information with each other. One would find an alternate passage here, while another would find the shop where they were selling the chain whip. It was quite a fun experience to be had, and it gave us a real sense of accomplishment that we were able to progress through a game whose cryptic clues and false messages would have otherwise hindered such progress if you didn't know any better. And when one of us would eventually beat the game for the first time, it was a celebration for the ages with sweeping parades, guzzling beverages, and naked women. Okay, not so much the naked women, but we did congratulate each other on a job well done each time one of us beat the game, even more so when we managed to uncover a brand new ending. Of course, this story, along with many others like it, are sparsely told in the 7-part commentary video that I did for this game last year, which sort of begs the question as to why I would bother with a single video basically saying what it took me 7 parts to say before, but more refined this time around. I guess the answer is sort of in that spiel before, so now that the completely necessary filler introductory sequence has been dispatched, let's get to the review proper. Castlevania II Simon's Quest serves as a proper chronological sequel to the original Castlevania, a concept that had been lost as the series progressed, where every subsequent entry went backwards, forwards, sideways, upside down, inside out, remade, rebooted, reimagined, recycled, regurgitated, and whatever hackneyed way the story could possibly go, except for maybe follow up on the previous title. Which makes me all the more thankful that there's the Lords of Shadow 2 to begin with, but I digress. Apparently, after Simon Belmont defeated Count Dracula in the original game, he began to feel weak and years later would discover that he was placed under a curse by the Count, and that the only way to break that curse was to acquire Dracula's 5 body parts, revive them, and defeat the Count once more. Unfortunately, Dracula's minions will do whatever it takes to make sure their lord is never revived by the Belmont, another foreign concept lost as the series progressed and only briefly revived in a couple later games. It's a fairly epic game in terms of the storyline, and even has 3 different endings to see depending on your overall performance in the game. So for the most part, you're traveling over the land acquiring weapons and items, gathering clues to aid you on your quest, and eventually collecting the 5 body parts of Dracula, which are found in various mansions. Collecting the body parts will also instill additional abilities should you equip them. For example, Dracula's Rib grants you a shield to deflect fireballs, Dracula's Heart persuades the ferryman on Dead River to escort you to another island, Dracula's Eyeball allows you to see hidden items, Dracula's Nail restores your whip's ability to break certain blocks, something that you needed holy water for, and finally Dracula's Ring allows you to do absolutely all. Seriously, practically 2 decades of playing this game, and I still have no clue as to what Dracula's Ring does aside from being a necessity to access the final stretch of the game along with the Magic Cross, which also is another item that's seemingly useless. Simon's Quest controls similarly enough to the original Castlevania, so when you start a new game you only have the basic whip, jump, climb stairs, up and B for special weapons, 3 lives and it's over. The control's relatively unchanged from the first game, which means you'll have some trouble with special weapons on stairs, but if you're used to the controls in Castlevania then there's virtually no adjustment to be made in Simon's Quest. And even if you've never played the original Castlevania, this issue isn't necessarily a game killer, and for the most part, you might not notice unless you pay attention. But again, it's not a big deal, you'll get used to it after a while. Probably the biggest addition made to Castlevania 2 was a password system that allows you to save your progress somewhat. All your items and strength upgrades are stored in this password system. This is somewhat of a step down from the Japanese version, which possessed a save feature, much like in Metroid and Zelda, due to the game originally being released on the Famicom Disk System. Now, no doubt some people will complain about this little detail and claim that the Japanese version has a superior saving system because that's what anyone exposed to overseas Japanese imports will say regardless of whether it's true or not. But quite honestly, if you hadn't known about that, you probably would not have cared. Really, all I could tell you is be happy you could save it all because this is a rather lengthy title, and honestly, the password system included in this game isn't any more convoluted than what's found in other games. In fact, 4 segments of 4 characters in a password isn't any more ridiculous than what's used in some other NES password systems. Castlevania 2 as a whole is plenty easier than the original Castlevania as far as difficulty goes. However, because it's more of an adventure game than anything else, it's a longer game too. The general issue is trying to figure out what to do next, because the majority of the advice you get from townspeople in the game are either lies or garbled or both. Even the clues given from hidden books you find throughout the game, the only legitimate clues apparently, are vaguely helpful, forcing you to seek other means to find your way. This is a bit of a problem when someone is trying to enjoy a game and they have to refer to a strategy guide to figure out the next move. Although, as I stated before, I never had this problem, and neither did a few friends of ours who also had this game back in the day. But a Worlds of Power Simon's Quest novella did reveal the presence of a transporting tornado at a later point in the game, something that I never knew about during my initial playthroughs, and neither did anybody else. And I discovered this tornado after having beaten the game countless times before, so go figure. Even so, playing this game without a strategy guide isn't an impossibility. Really, once I found out that kneeling by a lake with a blue crystal unveils another path, I ended up experimenting on a few other lakes with this blue crystal or dead ends before eventually forgetting about it and just taking the game-breaking route instead, which usually cost me several lives but made me the envy of a few buddies before we discovered the fucking tornado. Oh yeah, the false blocks. You can't forget about those. Yeah, they're a bit of an annoyance at first, but once you figure out where they are, they're not so bad. Although, all things considered, false blocks do lead to one of the more ridiculous secret routes in Simon's Quest, such as this false wall that I discovered completely by accident. Now that's an example of a ridiculous secret. Kneeling by a lake with a blue crystal to unveil a secret path or falling through an invisible pitfall? Not so much. Aside from that, the enemies themselves are fairly easy to dispatch provided you have a powerful weapon in each new area you encounter. Most of them simply move back and forth, while a few will actually come out and attack you, and even then, a third-rate gamer could dispatch the opposition with relative ease. Even if you were to factor in the day-night mechanic, which only costs you 8 seconds of your life each time it happens, it doesn't really make much of a difference. All this does is double the number of hit points of each enemy outdoors, something that is generally a moot point if you have a powerful weapon such as a flame whip or something. All in all, this is indeed less difficult than the original Castlevania, but isn't simple by any means. Really, once you figure out where you're supposed to go, it's just a matter of grinding for hearts and experience in order to acquire equipment and weapons to conquer what's ahead. Visually speaking, Castlevania II Simon's Quest looks better in some respects and not so much in others when compared to its predecessor. No longer is Simon Belmont brown-colored sprite, now he wears a red vest and white boots, and is probably the whitest vampire hunter I've come across. I think it just looks cool and is a step up from the usual outfit, with the ultimate evolution of the character taking place in Super Castlevania IV, but I'm jumping ahead here. As for the rest of the game, the graphics are fairly good and the enemy design is alright. They have simple walking animations for the most part, and most don't really do much else in terms of animations, but they look fine. The various level environments are the only sore spot in Simon's Quest, not in the sense that they look bad, because they don't. I rather like the rugged towns and forests. It gives it a bit of a gothic, spooky feel, and the transition from day to night is a nice effect even if it does lag. But the issue with the world of Simon's Quest is just that there aren't enough diverse environments to truly distinguish the world you're exploring. In simpler terms, every forest or town you visit will look the same outside the various color palettes in use and general level layout. This is especially true of the various mansions where you have to acquire the body parts, which all look the same right down to certain bits of the level layout. It's almost akin to the original Metroid, where you're navigating through the various tunnels and suddenly get a sense of deja vu because you think you've been here before, but no, they just recycled the same tunnel layout, and as a result, you've lost focus and either have to backtrack or just plain give up and reset the game. At least in Castlevania II, you have some sense of where you are because they do change up the palette somewhat, and the enemies are also different colors in different parts of the game. Still, while the repetitive nature of the environments doesn't outright kill the game or anything, unless you have a good sense of direction or memorization, it can get easy to lose track of where you are. But then again, a little bit of common sense can go a long way, even in a game of obscure clues and people wanting to live together. Don't ask. Simon's Quest has a rather memorable soundtrack. It gave birth to bloody tears as far as anyone who has never touched Haunted Castle is concerned. However, while the music tracks are memorable and really set you in the mood of the game, there aren't that many tracks in general. As such, some people may find the in-game music to be repetitive after listening to it endlessly. Understandable in some respects. You can only take bloody tears for a long while before it starts getting tedious. However, those of us who have grown up in the NES era would be accustomed to this, as many games, especially in the early NES lifecycle, usually had only 1 or 2 songs playing constantly, and if the music is at least catchy or good, then it's no problem. Depends on one's tastes, I suppose. Sound effects are almost on par with the previous game. They kept the same whip snapping effect for the standard leather and thorn whips, but managed new whipping sounds for the chain and flame whips, something I wish they had retained in the follow-up Castlevania Dracula's Curse, but that's a story for another time. I'll be honest with you here, Castlevania II Simon's Quest was the very first Castlevania game that I've ever touched, and there is some sentimental value for me for that reason among others. With that having been said, however, Simon's Quest does falter a bit in regards to its execution.
I like the open-ended nature of the game. I like the fact that it's more of an adventure game than a straight-up platformer. I like that they tried something different for the second game and yet at the same time retained the solid gameplay mechanics that worked so well in the original Castlevania. The real issues that bring the overall package down are the repetitive backdrops, lackluster enemy AI, and the somewhat bewildering means of deciphering clues and figuring out what to do next. Despite these issues, Castlevania II Simon's Quest is still a pretty decent title and certainly a worthwhile entry in the Castlevania series, a precursor if you will to the style of play that would be adopted and perfected in a later entry. While it is not the best of the bunch, it is nowhere near as bad or as terrible as some people will claim it to be. If you get a chance, give it a shot, it's actually pretty decent.